Good morning to all the esteemed participants. It is an absolute delight to extend a warm welcome to each one of you at the 18th Sustainability Summit. We will now begin the session on fast-tracking industry towards an economically viable and just net zero future. It is truly an honor and privilege to extend my heartfelt welcome to all the panel members and the moderator of the session to the dais. I request the moderator, Mr. T.V. Narendran, B20 co-chair, the Energy, Climate and Resource Efficiency Task Force, CEO and MD, Tata Steel Limited, to kindly initiate the discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're getting started straight away because we're running a bit late and we'll try and make up some time. So, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, honored guests, and valued stakeholders, it gives me great pleasure to address this gathering at this session on fast-tracking industry towards an economically viable and just net zero future at this 18th CII Sustainability Summit. I would like to take this moment to extend a warm welcome to the panelists for the session, Mr. Dominic Warre, who is the Executive Vice President of WBCSD, Ms. Antha Williams, who is the Lead Environment, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Mr. Rizwan Sumar, who is CEO and he's not here. So Mr. Wim Van Gerwen, who is the Vice President, India Operations of ArcelorMittal, Nippon Steel India, Mr. Fabrice Eden, who is a Group International Affairs Advisor of ENGIE. As industry leaders, we are well aware of the pressing need to address climate change and transition towards a net zero emissions economy, and we heard about that in the opening session as well. Under the ambit of India's G20 presidency and B20 India, this year's Sustainability Summit presents us with a unique opportunity to build convergence between the global north and the global south on charting a collaborative pathway towards an economically viable and just net zero future. This year, the B20 Task Force on Energy, Climate Change and Resource Efficiency has featured industry representatives from across the G20 countries deliberating on several key climate change issues from a business perspective. What is evident from these intensive consultations is that in order to achieve our ambitious goal of a net zero future, we need to focus on a few priorities. Firstly, embracing clean technologies such as renewable energy, biofuels, EVs is essential. And in addition to this, we need to boost support for emerging technologies such as hydrogen, carbon capture, also CCUNS, and again we heard about this in the opening session, as well as battery storage. Each country needs to consider what technologies are appropriate given the regional and local market conditions, economic situation, growth and development imperatives. And what is crucial is that the speed at which clean technologies are being adopted needs to be accelerated in order to keep the hopes of a 1.5 degree centigrade future alive. And this will not happen without government-industry collaborations and an enabling policy ecosystem which allows businesses to innovate and implement the said technologies. Secondly, accelerating the grid integration of renewable energy is critical. Scaling up the utilization of sources like solar, wind, and geothermal power will play a vital role in reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Ensuring a stable and reliable supply of renewable energy requires investments in energy storage technologies to overcome challenges related to intermittency and promote long-term sustainability. Thirdly, adopting circular economy principles in business models is integral to our journey of net zero. By embracing this approach, we can minimize waste, maximize resource efficiency, and promote the recycling and reuse of materials throughout our industrial processes. Prioritizing sustainable product design, considering the entire life cycle of products and their environmental impacts, leads to goods that are both economically viable and environmentally responsible. Resource efficiency and circular economy principles will also be crucial in addressing the responsible use and recycling of energy-critical minerals such as lithium, which will be required to manufacture clean energy technologies. Fourthly, a just transition and social inclusivity are fundamental considerations. For the first time in a decade this year, we have seen the number of people without access to electricity rise, the majority being from Africa and Asia. And this is due to the energy crisis and rising energy costs. Therefore, it is paramount that we take into account country-specific challenges on energy security, affordability, and access. Equipping our workforce with the necessary skills through upskilling and reskilling initiatives is also crucial during this transformative phase. A just and inclusive transition ensures that no one is left behind, and moreover, businesses also have a critical role in ensuring a nature-positive transition, one that prevents nature loss and promotes biodiversity conservation. Finally, all these challenges cannot be addressed without adequate financial support and investment, and we heard some numbers earlier today. The current levels of global finance, climate finance, needs to be enhanced significantly in order to ensure we are on track to achieving the goals which are goals of the 2030 agenda. Governments and multilateral development banks need to step up efforts towards enabling private capital through various mechanisms such as first loss guarantees, currency risk hedging, and creating a robust pipeline of ready-to-invest clean energy projects. Another issue that must be addressed is the financial support that the Global South requires to decarbonize. Developing countries have growing economies, associated development needs, and are also amongst the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It is essential that the Global North increases their financial support and provides access to low-cost, long-term concessional climate finance to the Global South. In conclusion, the path to an economically viable and just net zero future demands collaborative and decisive action from each one of us. By embracing technological advancements, accelerating renewable energy adoption, implementing circular economy principles, ensuring a just transition, and securing financial support, we can fast-track our industries towards a net zero future. Let us lead by example, setting new standards for business-led climate action and economic prosperity, and let us embark on this transformative journey hand in hand, leaving a lasting legacy of a responsible industry and sustainable progress. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And with this, I'm going to invite my fellow panelists for their opening remarks, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A. So I'll now invite Mr. Dominic Warre, the Executive Vice President of WPCSD, to share his thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for those opening remarks. And before I go any further, it's a delight to be here at the CII Sustainability Summit, so thank you all for joining. And in particular, our chair for this panel, Mr. Narendran, thank you for your excellent chairing of the B20 group on climate, energy, and resource efficiency. I think they are excellent recommendations, and under your stewardship, it's come up with some very, very practical thoughts, so congratulations to that. Okay, so we've decided quickly as a panel that we'll have an inclusive and engaging conversation rather than be too formal. So we'll speak from the chairs. Some introductory remarks to this conversation. You set the scene very well, sir. I'd just like to kind of put a couple of underscoring points on this. If we were having this conversation maybe 5, 6 years ago, you'd probably think it was a bit abstract, it wasn't urgent, it wasn't pressing, but somewhere out there we really should do something about this risk that is climate change. I would say that every one of us has experienced, in particular within India, and in particular if you live in Delhi, the impacts of the El Nino effect this year, which, as you know, every 5 or 7 years means that the winds, which are the trade winds that blow westwards and bring cold water up from the east, change, and that means that the ocean temperature rises and has a domino effect on the weather patterns. This is the most extreme El Nino that we're experiencing in history, so says NOAA. NOAA also are suggesting that we're looking at about a 3-4% hit on global GDP. That's about $3 trillion. Your own Indian Reserve Bank in May estimated that just from heat stress and the difficulties of working in such hot weather, that up to 4 or 5% of India's GDP would be hit, and that's under non-El Nino conditions, and that's not taking account of any impacts on infrastructure or assets. So this is quite real to the economy, and it will only get worse unless the urgency and the rapid action that is in the title of this discussion takes place. Now, from the industry side, what's interesting, and we'll hear, I'm sure, from our dear colleagues on ENGIE on the energy side, but there's a system, if you like, across the industrial sector. And as you may know from great work that has been undertaken, including from colleagues at CII and Bloomberg Philanthropy and others along the way, it's interesting that actually there are 7 or so key global industrial sectors that deliver about 30% of global emissions: cement, steel, aluminium, aviation, heavy-duty transport, that's sort of trucking, shipping, and steel. So these are the 7 sectors that are delivering a large chunk of emissions into our atmosphere at the moment. And in each of those sectors, there's an interesting set of complexities, not just around setting a plan for how one might, by 2030 or 2050, have a net zero trajectory, but also understanding the scale of the new technologies that are required. We've mentioned hydrogen, we've mentioned carbon capture and storage, mentioned electrification, and other energy sources as well. There's also understanding the scale that is required of the new close to net zero products, the clean steel, the clean aluminium in the chemical sector, and who is going to be the demandeur for those products, who's going to make the procurement request, not just from the public sector, but also the private sector to change that demand. There is the policy environment. We heard from Minister earlier. How important is that in terms of accelerating the transition from the policy perspective? And of course, there is the finance, both in terms of the investment that is required to do this and where that money comes from, including the private sector, but also the financial mechanisms to make it happen. So that's kind of a list of about 7 or 8 things which actually have to happen in harmony rather than separately, which makes this quite complicated. And that's why those sectors that I mentioned on the industry side are generally termed as hard to abate. Not necessarily because the technology is not there, or because the finance is not there, or because we don't know what the right policies are, but the adjacency of bringing all of these things together at the same time, at scale and quickly, has quite a high transaction cost attached to it. And the leadership that the government of India is showing in collaboration with CII, and particularly as you see through the G20 process, is perhaps to try and break down those silos so that financing, technology, road mapping, if you like, of industry transition, corporate leadership, policy and planning can work together to make this change happen. And that's at the heart, really, of the challenge. Underneath that is something else. And those of you from the industry side who are here will appreciate what I'm about to say. And that is that there is increasing interest from the investor community, from stakeholders, and from the regulatory community to try and sharpen what it means to have good corporate performance and accountability in terms of that net zero transition. What targets is your company setting in relation to the science? What kind of transition plan is being developed in terms of the investments, the CapEx, the OpEx, the HR changes that one needs? How are you accounting for that transition on a regular basis, perhaps using the greenhouse gas protocol, scopes 1, scopes 2, and across the value chain, scopes 3? And how are you disclosing it? And we can see that the International Sustainability Standards Board is already coming up with guidelines on disclosure. And how is all of that consistent and applicable to emerging and developing economies? So this kind of system of corporate performance and accountability really underpins that transition for each of those key sectors that I mentioned. And without all of those pieces in play, we will not get the rapid change that we seek. So at the heart of that, really, comes this essence of collaboration across different areas of the economy, comes the need to build that corporate performance and accountability system that works smoothly across all of those different steps that I mentioned, such that those who are moving first and fastest and most successfully can get their message across to the investor, the policymaker community, and to stakeholders. And that this is structured in a way that it's not siloed out. So it's not just one industrial sector that is taking all of the burden, but it is across our corporate ecosystem. And that's the final point I'd like to leave you with, which is the cost allocation of all of this, because it's not just a steel plant, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this, but it's kind of the, who is going to buy my close to zero net steel? If my market is in Europe and I'm producing in India, how can I show that that steel is net zero across the value chain and navigate through things like a carbon border adjustment mechanism? And how can the trade regime be right for that? And how can I make sure that in this transition, it's just and equitable, not just for workers, which is so important, and not just on the balance of developing and emerging markets versus the West, but it is equitable such that there is access to this new global market regime that will be developed. And so these elements really underpin the need for that level playing field in terms of that corporate performance and accountability. Everyone uses the same Scope 3 measurement. Everyone can see who is producing the close to net zero products and services that other markets will require, and that will be fairly represented in trade across boundaries. So that's why it's quite a complicated issue, but why it's so important to get right, and why this discussion today and some that we'll be having through the coming days will be so important, and why with partnerships with Bloomberg, Philanthropy, and others, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, I think we'll start to see quite some significant movement through to COP28 in terms of some industry transition partnerships that will take shape to drive this agenda forward. And the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, including its members, of which NG is a proud and very exciting member of ours, will be at the heart of that transition along those areas that I just described. So I hope that tries to set the scene in terms of some of the key sectors, some of the issues at stake, and the importance of how this agenda is interlinked to many other areas, including trade. So it's not just a national issue. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that dovetails well into what was discussed early in the morning. I think the Minister highlighted the importance of execution. I think for a long time we've debated whether there's a problem, then we took a long time to agree on the targets, and now we've come to the really the business end of the transition, which is the execution. And I think Dominic put it all together by saying that multiple things need to come in place. The adjacencies need to get addressed. Everything needs to come in place at the same time. And that's a complexity that we need to solve. And also, I think the financial, increasingly a balance sheet is going to be as much about non-financial metrics as financial metrics. And that puts the onus on the corporates to not only perform, but also report it so that the investor community can see it. With that, I'm going to invite Anta to give us her thoughts.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Narendran, for chairing this, and to my other panelists. I look forward to your comments and our discussion. I really want to thank CIMA and our partners at the Confederation for Indian Industry and its Center for Sustainable Development. This is a well-timed and urgent conversation in advance of B20 and G20, and putting sustainability and these issues right at the heart of the agenda is really important, and we really appreciate the leadership and the partnership. At Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're the home of Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City and founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies. We have a mission to ensure better, longer lives for the greatest number of people. And so the comments this morning about the importance not just of the urgency of tackling climate change, but the importance of putting lives and livelihoods right at the center of that project really resonates for us at Bloomberg. I don't need to talk, I don't think, to this group about the imperative of acting now, but I think we've seen the impacts of human-caused climate change coming fast and furiously, and it's been quite an alarming, frankly, summer on that front. I think the good news is there's opportunity to act, and there's a lot that we can do, especially when we work together. Our founder at Bloomberg Philanthropies, Mike Bloomberg, serves as a UN Special Envoy for Climate Ambition and Solutions. And based in large part on his experience as an entrepreneur and also as the 3-term mayor of New York, really takes a whole of government, whole of society approach to tackling urgent problems, climate change lead among them. And so it's really ingrained in our approach, this important notion of partnerships, of bringing together civil society with governments, with industry and business together to be able to meet the scale of the need and what we have to do to solve the urgent problem of climate change. And so, as we've been discussing, industry and business forms the backbone of economies. We need the economic growth and the livelihoods that it supports. And at the same time, industry can be a major contributor to air pollution, and so the opportunity of cleaning up industry for all means a healthier, more sustainable, more breathable air for all of us. And so at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we've been supporting work on climate action on issues like air pollution in partnership with business and industry in the US and globally and here in India. And so to take a couple of examples, globally, we've been working, as Dominic mentioned, with partners like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Science-Based Target Initiative and others to support businesses that are taking action. Now there are over 4,000 businesses representing a third of the global economy that are committed to science-based targets. We also know that decarbonizing heavy industry is a project that's being taken on collaboratively at the global level, and I'd highlight a great example that we've been supporting, the Mission Possible Partnership, which is founded by the World Economic Forum, the Energy Transition Commission, RMI, and We Mean Business Coalition. And that partnership really brings together industry players to ensure that heavy industry reaches net zero carbon emissions. It's been really, I think, incredible to see the bright spots of bold action. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Tata Steel among them, one of the early adopters of the framework on from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, an effort that Mike chaired and helped start. And that issue of not just disclosure, but disclosure moving towards apples-to-apples standards that apply across companies and industries and that can be implemented with regulation at the global level. We've been really delighted to partner with CII's Center for Sustainable Development on the Climate Action Charter, which includes over 200 Indian businesses, as well as the Cleaner Air, Better Life initiative, which includes over 100 Indian businesses. As part of our partnership with the Indian Ministry of Environment on the National Clean Air Program, we keep seeing the importance of industrial and business action in our work to clean air with Indian cities. And I just want to share one quick example in the city of Surat, where we've been working with the Municipal Corporation and State Pollution Control Board through technical partners like WRI India and TERI. And in Surat, analysis found that industries contributed about a quarter of the air pollution in the city. And in response to the data, the construction industry and others worked together to adopt cleaner standards, and as a result, have really made a big difference in a short amount of time. In combination with measures from the city, like the Innovative Emissions Trading Scheme, the city's pollution levels have seen a really remarkable dip of more than 40% over just a 5-year period. So we know that progress is possible. The results of this work have been a promising sign that tackling emissions at the industry level is an effective strategy, both to clean up the air today and to build more sustainable practices for the future. I just want to be quick, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say we see 4 really practical near-term actions that all industries can take right now to make a big impact in our journey to net zero. The first is to use clean energy, and the second is to improve energy efficiency. And clean energy in particular is a foundation of clean industry, and it's the reason at Bloomberg Philanthropies we're working on clean energy development in more than 30 countries plus the European Union. For example, in Delhi, we've worked for the first time on a new blended finance effort that helps support battery storage and electric vehicle adoption. And we can see that these changes have the potential to big impact, but they're pulling us in philanthropy to think in new ways about how our nimble dollars can be used to support the transition. The third opportunity for industry to make a difference now is to switch to electric vehicles. We know that road transport contributes 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and trucking alone is 40% of road transport emissions, and so there's a big opportunity there. And the final change I would highlight is to reduce waste by recycling and reusing the materials that they can as much as possible. So recognizing that change looks different in each industrial sector, there's lessons to be learned among companies piloting innovative approaches. There's big opportunity for collaboration across all sectors of society and for lessons learned, including from the rapid change that's happening here in India to other countries, particularly in the global south. So I'm excited to dive into the discussion today. We're looking forward to working with all of you towards a prosperous and net zero future. Thanks.
Thanks, Anta. That's very helpful. In fact, I'll leave a point with you, which we'll come back if there's time in the Q&A. As we electrify process industry, storage solutions becomes a very important part of scaling up clean energy for use in the process industry, and we'll discuss that if there's some time. With that, I'm going to invite a fellow colleague from the steel industry. We both belong to hard-to-abate sectors. Willem works with ArcelorMittal, one of the largest steel companies in the world, with some very ambitious goals for reduction of the carbon footprint. Over to you, Willem, for your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Namaskar, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me here. Let's kick it off immediately. What is the Indian challenge? How to increase our steel capacity with a factor 2 or even more to satisfy the needs of the Indian society in the next decade, and keeping emissions stable or even lowering, knowing that we are already in India having 12% of greenhouse gas emissions due to the steel industry, whereas the world average is about 7%. And do this in a profitable way, because there is no growth when you are not profitable, and in a global market, and in such a footprint that is able to be fully decarbonized in the next decades. That's basically the challenge. Let's start with the basics. Steel can be produced from basically two routes. One is the primary iron ore route, which is two major technologies, blast furnace and DRI, where what we see in the latter is that it is certainly the best one to decarbonize, but it is working on gas, natural gas or hydrogen, which is not profitable in the short or the medium term. You have to understand that in this primary route, 70 to 80% of the emissions are just due to the reduction of iron ore. It means it is not compressible. So hence, decarbonization in the steel industry becomes an energy topic. It's just energy. Its problem is also process, but basically it's energy. Second route is the secondary scrap route, where this is 100% recyclable. It is only a fraction of the greenhouse gases, because you don't have to do this reduction anymore. It is already iron. But there is, in India, a huge shortage due to the fact that it's a developing country and we do not have a lot of steel in the past, so we will not expect a lot of scrap in the future also. So there are 5 decarbonization pathways we are following, and almost all our competitors too. First, of course, is the operational efficiency improvement, where certainly there is a big advantage of having to design new built plants, the most modern in the world, with performance supply chains, include all the best practices, including artificial intelligence and digitalization. The second one is to bank on the circular economy. As explained, scrap reduces the energy consumption and the emissions drastically, but we have there a limited supply, so we have to do whatever we can in improving the collection, the sorting, and the processing. The third pathway is scaling up low carbon fuel sources. Coal versus lower carbon fuel sources. You would say natural gas. It's a very good transitional fuel, but its profitability is difficult, especially in a non-carbon market. And I told you before that steel industry is a global market. So we have to, if we want to be competitive, we have to be globally it's a global issue. Biomass can also be an alternative, but will be limited. And of course, off-gases, sequestrating and recyclable products is also an issue where we can think about. A very important fourth pathway is the greening of the grid. We have a lot of renewable resources, and this can lower our indirect emissions substantially. This is a very important and possible pathway that we are following, and all our competitors also do this very extensively. And last but not least, with all the four former things, we will not get to zero emission. It's clear that we need probably hydrogen and carbon capture, usage and storage innovations. They are for the moment commercially unviable in a carbon market, as I said before. But just to give you an example, we estimate that when we would produce the steel from hydrogen, the production cost would double. So this is an order of magnitude that we have to take into account. Although in my company we have a lot of DRI-based units, we could immediately produce 30% of our production, 2 million tons, in green steel. There is only one problem: we do not have the hydrogen, and certainly not affordable hydrogen. Very simple. And we can easily ramp this up, because this is even without any change. We can even go much beyond that. So the commercial viability is a very important point, but also there is a low technical maturity. So having said all that, I think balance and harmony is needed. I think an ambitious policy and regulation is needed here, because otherwise we will never bridge these factors or these difficulties to decarbonize steel industry, as mentioned before. A clear demand signal from the market and the government is, we think, very necessary. Tax incentives to kickstart green manufacturing, and especially the development of renewables. An infrastructure development, we can think about green grids. We'll need a lot of investments also. CCUS pipelines for the transport of CO2, and a carbon market, probably. Foreign investment initiatives can help to scale up fast. And last but not least, we need hydrogen R&D innovations to be followed up much more stringently, and pilots have to be built to make sure that we can do the decarbonization of the future. With regard to my company, we are of course aligning ourselves to the engagements we have taken for 2050 on the zero targets, as well for the country as for the parent companies. We are working very hard on building wind parks of renewables. We have a first 1 gigawatt covered. We also have our existing DRI and EAF capacity, which is very easy to decarbonize, which we will try to keep alive also when the natural gas prices rise very high. This is a very big challenge for the moment. The scrap utilization we will reinforce, because most of the time we can think that The scrap will become more and more available as the country is developing, and hence we can easily blend this scrap and in our existing facilities. Of course, we will have to work on the collection and the sorting. And then last but not least, we have the breakthrough technologies, which I mentioned before, where we are helping government and stakeholders in having the right policies to develop this as well on the academic to make sure that we have the right R&D and the financial support. These, Mr. Chairman, are, I think, the most important things for the steel industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Wim. And I think what Wim has articulated is, even if the intent is there, the desire is there, for some of the hard-to-abate sectors, the journey is not only complex, it's costly, and part of that cost will certainly be borne by the industry, but in some sense, there has to be support from governments, as well as we heard in the morning, customers need to be willing to pay more for greener products, because otherwise, it's not economically viable to do this transition. And I think that's one of the key challenges that the industry is facing. I'll now invite Fabrice to share his thoughts. NG is again out there right in front in this transition. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the moderator and colleagues to be here. Also thanking CIMA for having us here. The chairman of NG is a co-chair of one of the working group on energy and climate. We've been working closely on a policy paper that will be introduced this Friday at the B20 for head of states and head of government for the business perspective on climate change and energy. I would like to, two of my colleagues made more remarks about the macro picture. I would like to come more to the micro to explain to you what an energy company is doing concretely in this path for the fast tracking of the decarbonization. For those of you who don't know NG, NG is a global reference in low carbon energy and services. Our mission, we are trying to accelerate the transitions towards a net zero economy. So concretely, we have decided to be net zero by 2045. And you have to bear in mind that NG was originally a gas company, our DNA was gas, and this is quite a big challenge to transform completely our business from fossil energy into a fully net zero company. So I would like to just go through a little bit how we do that. We have actually also been certified by SBTi to be well below 2 degrees. So the pathway that I'm going to describe now has been certified. So what do we do concretely to reach that target? We have mostly 4 levers. The first one was to phase out completely from coal. Our target for Europe is by 2025 to be completely out of coal, and more globally 2027. Concretely, when we decide to phase out of coal, we don't just sell it. We first try to see if we can close it down or to convert it into a different infrastructure. For instance, in Australia, we have converted one of our plant, Yarra in Victoria, into a new facility to produce batteries. And the last resort, of course, is to sell them. The other lever is the development of renewables. In NG, we are present basically on the entire value chain of renewables. We are doing solar, we are doing offshore wind, and we are doing regular onshore. Concretely, we are now more or less about 42% of our energy mix is made of renewables. And we are hoping by 2030 to be at 50%, and in 2045 to have to reach our net zero, which de facto will mean about 80 megawatt of renewable energy. So the third levers that I'd like to put forward, and which is very important for us at ENGIE because we've been, mostly present on gas, is that we believe that we cannot electrify everything, which during our policy discussions with other B20, most of the focus for the policy paper was actually on electrifying, but our position is that we still need molecules. And therefore, we are working on greening those molecules, and we have a series of technologies that we are working on. The first one is biomethane. ENGIE has produced 1 terawatt of e-methane this year, and we are planning to have 10 terawatts of e-methane by 2030. For those of you who don't know, there are several technologies, but we're basically using agricultural waste or urban waste to produce e-methane. And the second lever for greening the gases is, as my colleague mentioned earlier, it's green hydrogen. And our target is by 2030 to have a capacity of 4 gigawatts of electrolyzers. Hopefully, with this gas, we will also be able to decarbonize part of our production of electricity with the CCGTs. For the moment, for instance, we have a plant in the Netherlands, which we are hoping by the end of the year will work 50% on hydrogen and not on gas anymore. The last levers that we were using, it's also for the sake of flexibility, is building batteries. Batteries, given the intermittency of renewable energy, we are depending on wind, on the sun. We need to develop those flexibility capacities, and we are aiming to have about 4 gigawatts of battery by 2030. So all this, obviously, it's figures, it's what we're aiming for, but concretely what we are doing within the company to push our different global business units to reach that target. And this is actually also something which I wanted to emphasize on. It's the operationalization of our targets. And most of our global business units, in addition to financial KPIs, they have now also KPIs in terms of carbon emissions. We are giving to our global business units a certain amount of emissions that they can use for 2 years. And we are very strict in not letting them go beyond that. And I will give you a small example. A couple of months ago, one of the GBUs came to our CEO and presented a project which was very profitable for the company. The CEO was ecstatic, and she said, "Wonderful, I want more projects like these." And they told her, "Well, we have already exhausted our carbon emission allotment, so we will have to wait for next year for that." And I think it's actually very important to emphasize that without operationalizing, it will be very difficult. And this is actually the job of the private sector. Politicians, governments tend to announce figures which we need to come forward and operationalize. Moving from that more specifically to the issue of regulation, for getting to the targets that I mentioned, we believe that it's extremely important to have a stable and visible investment environment. For our project, we have decided to invest about $23 billion for the next 2 years for renewables. And without having a visible and stable investment environment, it will be extremely difficult to move forward. This is why we are welcoming and pushing regulations like we had in Europe, the Net Zero Industry Act, which is currently being finalized. This is also why we have been extremely interested in what IRA has been producing in the US. This is one of the reasons why we are developing our renewables in the US at a faster path. And the other two important elements for reaching that is faster connection to the grid. In some geographies, we have projects that are ready to be connected, but it's been 2, 3, 4 years waiting for that connection. And the other issue is permitting. I know, for instance, in the US, it's a big issue that it's now being discussed at the legislative level. Same in France. And I hope also that it will also be addressed here in India, where we are already operating about 1.7 gigawatt, and we have higher ambitions, which will very much depend on regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrice. I know we are running out of time, so I'm going to ask each of you for your comments on one question. So it gives those of you coming later on some time to think about it. The topic is about fast-tracking industry towards an economically viable and just net zero future. So while we've shared our thoughts as part of this panel, if there's one thing that's important for us to fast-track this journey, because I think all of us agree on the goals, all of us agree on the challenges. In your minds, what would be the one thing which is important? So I'll start with Dominic. Do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks.
And I'll ask the rest of them to share their thoughts on the same thing.
Thanks for the question. You can see from the discussions on the panel that we've got a couple of things here we have to navigate. We've got level of depth within operational delivery and all kinds of great targets and aspects being met. We've got a landscape where it could be possible, but the technology is a bit far away, it's costly. We've got the cost burden thing. And then you've got an overview of how do these pieces come together: policy, finance, investment, leadership from some of the companies that we've got here to make it happen. So if there was one thing, and I think it's something that we identified through our members at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, it's like anything in life, we just need proofs of concept. We need some breakthrough or lighthouse initiatives which are across a value chain, whereby the kind of cluster comes together and the scaling of the green hydrogen or the energy is there, the permitting has arrived, the grid is able to do it. It can help, therefore, create the steel that is needed. There's a purchaser for that steel, maybe in the auto or built environment sector, and that steel is able to go across markets with the legacy that it is near close to zero, so people will accept it, and it's built. And the cost burden is shared across that value chain such that the consumer isn't left with all of the burden. You do that, it's hard to do it the first time, but the second or the third or the fourth time it gets easier and easier, then it gets replicable. Shipping, aviation with scalable, sustainable aviation fuels, petrochemicals, trucking, there's some very interesting developments in India on that one. So we just need that first wave. And I think we're getting close to that tipping point, which is the exciting thing, and many of you are involved in that, and that's something with Seema and the colleagues at CII that we'll be taking forward on this. So breakthrough, tipping point projects, proof of concept to show how this is going to get done, which bring together all of the elements that we've just heard.
Thanks, Dominic. So a collaboration across the value chain, maybe across geographies, across energy systems, whatever, to drive the transition. Thanks. Anta, for your thoughts.
I'll just build on that and say, proof of concept, getting the first little bit done, the first shovel in the ground, greasing the wheels to get things started. But I would just add on to that point to say then being unafraid to just steal the best ideas. The local leaders that we work with, a lot of the global mega city mayors through the C40 Climate Leadership Group, for example, often talk about just stealing each other's ideas in a way that enables them to scale faster, because instead of coming up with the target, coming up with the plan to get there, and then figuring out the financing and all those things, if you can just take it and implement quickly. We're seeing that as one example related to the industry conversation among those mayors and creating green shipping corridors, where they're figuring out, okay, if I have to decarbonize everything in a major shipping port, how does that happen? Who's interested in paying for it? What are the climate benefits, and how do I calculate it? And so those corridors then are enabling those localities to move faster than they would alone.
Thanks, Anta. I think this is something which is also part of the B20 recommendation, which is about how can ideas scale up across borders and so that the world benefits from it. Thanks. Wim?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that we have done a lot of R&D already. We know a lot of projects or the pilots. We are busy building them. We know relatively well what we can expect from these things. The problem for me is how can you start up a scale-up of a few million tons that is profitable? And for that, you need somehow a policy. And that is for me the main point into getting further and further and ramping up this green initiative.
Thanks, Wim. So you said how can we scale up and also make it viable? Is that what you said? Yeah. Thanks, Wim. Fabrice?
Thank you. I already mentioned the issue of the investment environment, which it's vital when you want to develop new renewable energy sources. And the other one I would mention is also regulation, and I will dwell into one specific example. The regulation globally for what it's deemed to be green hydrogen it differs, and it can be extremely complicated. I'll give you one example that maybe speaks to you. For the IRA, you have a combination of 3 criteria, which is additionality, time matching, and regionality. In the European Union, it's even worse, and we have countries, mostly in the Middle East, who want to export green hydrogen to Europe and come to us and say, please go and speak to the EU and tell them that the criteria that they're proposing are surreal. And this is part of the issue. If we have criteria that are very, very difficult to match, it will also impact on the cost.
Thank you, Fabrice. So, I think what's pretty clear, in the morning, in the first session, we heard about the importance of moving away from the conference rooms and into execution. But I think since many of us are from industry or represent industry, we know that execution is easier said than done, and execution often involves players across the value chains, across borders, competing sectors, sometimes collaborative sectors. So the challenge of execution is always there, and I think some of the points which came across is how do you have ideas which flow across borders? How do you scale it up, make it economically viable? How do you have the financial support that is required, the regulatory and the policy support that is required? And I think, and also collaborations across the value chains. One thing sometimes we underestimate is we've built efficiencies and resilience into the fossil fuel supply chains, particularly oil and coal, etc., because it's been moving across borders for over 100 years. We know the challenges of even transitioning from oil to gas. And as we move from gas to hydrogen, as we move to electrification of process industry, and electricity needs to move more easily across borders, I think there are a lot that needs to be done in the supporting environment and the regulatory environment. But I wish to thank my fellow panelists for bringing their experience and wisdom to this table, and thank you to the audience for listening to us patiently. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, with this we end our insightful panel discussion. We now request all our speakers and moderator to come forward for the launch of the brochure on net zero services offered by CII through its Centers of Excellence. Thank you. Our sincere gratitude goes out to our distinguished guests for making this an extremely engaging